Hey there, I'm Sean Finnegan, the host of Restitutio, and today my guest is Dr. Thomas Gaston, who holds a PhD in theology from the University of Oxford. Uh, Pretty obscure school, nobody's ever heard of. Just kidding. He's a specialist in historical Christology and early Christianity, and he's the author of Dynamic Monarchianism, the earliest Christology. And then you have a question mark in the subtitle there. Published by Theophilus Press, the imprint of the Unitarian Christian Alliance. Dr. Gaston, welcome to Restitutio.
Thanks, Sean. That's nice to be here.
So I was thinking you could begin just by introducing yourself and telling us about your journey of faith and your interest in Christology in particular. Could you get us started there?
Sure. Yeah. Uh, I was born into the Christadelphian community, so that's my background. I've been a Christadelphian most of my life. I was baptized at 16 into that community,
Mhm.
and have been part of that ever since, and have been engaged as a lay speaker within that community um, throughout. My interest in Christology, particularly from an academic perspective. I mean, I did a bachelor's in philosophy, but as part of that, I was able to take a one module of early Christianity from the classics department, and that really got me interested in that sort of historical side of Christianity. And then I went on to do a master's at the University of Birmingham,
Mhm.
where I was able to explore a little bit further into the developments that were taking place in the second and third century, and particularly in relation to the doctrine of the Trinity. Um, and that was for me able to bring an academic focus to the sort of things that was interesting to me from my Christian upbringing about the differences between what we believe and what mainstream Christianity believes in relation to the doctrine of the Trinity, and really sort of bring out some of the ideas about where this might be coming from. And then when I got to do my doctorate at Oxford, this was exactly what I was looking at: was where does the doctrine of Trinity come from? If it's not coming from the Bible, if it's not coming from the apostles, well, where did it come from? And exploring that, particularly in relation to the influence of Platonism on Christians in the second and early third century. So that's, I guess, um, what I was doing academically, and then from that, obviously created an interest, having looked at it from the perspective of those Christians who were beginning to teach something like the Trinity. That really sparked interest in me in trying to understand, well, what was the other side like? Who are the people who were not saying that? Who were saying the opposite in that same period, which then sort of sparked the research that led to the book.
Very good. And what was it like at Oxford?
Oxford's really interesting. I mean, it's unlike other universities in the sense of it's kind of got this collegiate system. So um, you've not just got the university, but you've got all the individual colleges, and you have to be a member of a college as well as the university. So there's sort of that interesting dynamic as well. And then which makes sort of the university quite disparate in many regards. But I had a good supervisor, Dr. Mark Edwards, who was uh, really supportive, even though he didn't obviously agree with necessarily with all the conclusions that I was coming to in the thesis. He was really supportive, and was really able to give some really helpful insight and challenge me in terms of refining my thinking on that. So that was really good. And then obviously really great to have access to like the great libraries and the resources they have there at Oxford. So I was really able to sort of get the best translations and commentaries and texts that were
Mhm.
available for studying this period. So that was really helpful too.
Very good. So let's talk about the book a little bit and what are you hoping to accomplish with this book? What would, the ideal result be after somebody reads it?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess a couple of audiences we have in mind. I mean, it's intended to be academically rigorous, so it's intended to be something that an academic historian of this period would read and at least take seriously in relation to the arguments that it's presenting. So I hope at least that those people who are sort of engaging it from that perspective see, the detail and the care that's gone into it, and at least take the argument seriously, even if that's not quite where they are. But it's also intended at least to be accessible to a more general reader, and to give people a bit of more perspective about this period. My hope is that, I guess a couple of hopes. I mean, I came at this from a period, in part, just out of interest, my sort of historical interest, as like, what can we know about people like this? I guess Unitarians in this period. Those who are they? What can we actually know from our sources about them, and how widespread might this be as a phenomenon? But then obviously the book tries to do something else, which is tries to pin those different individuals together into a single narrative as to like where might they be coming from. And the subtitle of the book, Earliest Christology, ? Is about whether actually, like, the overarching narrative that joins these people together is that actually they were representing a tradition that had existed within Christianity all the way back to the earliest apostles. So hopefully that narrative is convincing to people, and actually sort of gives a different story than maybe the one that we sometimes hear from mainstream Christianity, in terms of like the doctrine of the Trinity being early and apostolic.
Yeah. Let's talk about orthodoxy for a moment. In your book early on, you wrote that you don't like the terms proto-orthodox or incipient orthodoxy. Why not? What's the problem there?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's a really challenging word, and it's a really challenging challenging problem. I think when you're dealing with this from a historical perspective, about trying not to project modern categories on historical figures. So even if we assume that we know what we mean by orthodoxy now in the modern setting, as opposed to heresy, for example, or as opposed to sort of non-mainstream views, applying those to historical figures might be taken to imply at least that there was an established orthodoxy at that period, or that or that the doctrinal position of these characters were similar to modern orthodoxy. The problem I have with proto-orthodoxy as a term, I understand why people use it, because it sort of is indicative of those people who are beginning to think about along the lines of what would later become orthodoxy, but it implies a sort of directionality, and maybe even a sort of inevitability about the direction of travel in terms of the development of those ideas in that period, and that I think can be misleading. So if you think about someone like Justin Martyr, who I talk quite a lot about in the book, who is a Christian in the mid to late 2nd century, he is developing ideas that I guess one might describe as proto-orthodox, in the sense that he has a sort of triad of Father, Son, and Spirit. So he's pointing in the direction of what would become the Trinity, but he is not, strictly speaking, a Trinitarian himself in terms of that orthodox terms. And it's far from obvious that his views should have become the mainstream. They do, in fact, become mainstream in part because he gets the support of the church in Rome and other influential figures in Christianity that period. But it's entirely plausible that something else might have happened and it gone a different way. So I'm cautious as that idea of assuming that these ideas were inevitable in any sense.
Yeah, or that he was in some sense half-baked.
Yeah,
I'm sure he thought his views were mature and well established. He probably wouldn't have said, "Oh, I'm gesturing at some other greater understanding that I don't quite know what to call yet."
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, he would have strenuously argued that he was right. Absolutely.
Right, right. And if you did have someone with Justin Martyr's Christology today, um, almost all mainstream Trinitarian Christians would recognize that person as not proto-orthodox. They would recognize that person as heretical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. He is
So
not.
that's problematic.
Yeah.
It's not
Absolutely.
it's not really compatible. His view is not really compatible with the Trinity, but it from an evolutionary point of view, you could say, oh, well, this is one step
Yeah.
along the way of development. But yeah, I can see what you're saying here. This even just this word orthodox is very problematic for me, because it means right opinion or
Mm.
straight opinion, right? So, of course, I think I'm Orthodox, and you think
Yes.
you're Orthodox. Everyone thinks they're Orthodox, right? So, like,
Yes.
I'm a little loath to take that term and apply it to someone whose beliefs I think are incorrect, right?
Yeah.
So, but whatever. We don't always get to pick how scholars use terms, right?
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about dynamic monarchians. Who in the world are dynamic monarchians? Why is it that people, even who hold to Unitarian views today, have never even
Yeah.
heard of this term? And could you comment on that, as well as like why you chose that for the title of your book?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good point. So um, it's probably worth emphasizing that dynamic monarchianism is a modern term, and when I say modern, I mean sort of 18th, 19th century. I don't mean but it wasn't a term that people in the second or third century would have referred to themselves as, and in one sense, it's a made up category in the sense that there was no one single body or community that the people that this term represents. There's no sort of church of dynamic monarchianism or anything, and people wouldn't have recognized that as a thing in that period. So I picked the term because it is a recognized term, because it's something that is known within scholarship. Uh, but I intentionally tried to um, give a little bit more definition as to the sort of people that I was interested in, and attempting to cover in the book. So just to talk about the term itself. So monarchian um, refers to this idea of one ruler, I suppose, but it's about those Christians who had a view of God where effectively there was just one person at the top. Um, and then scholars would have distinguished two different types of monarchian in this period: the dynamic monarchians and the modal monarchians. So the modal monarchians sort of maintained this one ruler perspective within God by effectively subsuming Son, and Spirit under the Father, by effectively making them three different roles of the same person. So they sort of deviate from what would become the Trinity in that way. Whereas the dynamic monarchians, this word dynamic is referring to power, and it's the idea that, um, from at least from the perspective of the scholars who coined this term, this idea that Jesus um, is a man who is given power at his baptism at the Holy Spirit, and that's how he becomes special. Whilst and the monarchian part is referring to the idea that the Father is overall, and that the Son never sort of ascends to that same level of equality with the Father. So it's a bit of a convoluted term. I was trying to pull out those specifically, those people in this period who did not believe in the pre-existence of Jesus, but who were otherwise were, I'm going to use that awful term orthodoxy again, but were otherwise sort of recognized as sort of mainstream Orthodox Christians. So these weren't people who were, making up their own scriptures or inventing their own prophets or anything like this. These were people who, accepted the core tenets of Christianity as per other Christians of this period,
Mhm.
But for them, Jesus didn't pre-exist before his birth in a personal sense.
Very good. Very good. And so, would you say that today we essentially use the term biblical Unitarian to refer to dynamic monarchians, or would you want to point out some sort of distinction there?
I mean, it's a great point, and it's the sort of struggles around that, that term Unitarianism, and um, I think are sort of illustrative of the sort of the struggles that we come to with sort of picking correct names for things, and the terms we want to use, and maybe slapping biblical in the front of Unitarianism to try and distinguish it from other sort of ways around it. Unitarianism, I think, illustrates that same problem. I think broadly we're talking about the same sorts of people in relation to their Christology.
Mhm.
One of the things that the book, I mean, and one of the things that the book doesn't do too much of is try and describe the other theological positions of the individuals that we're describing. So I was primarily trying to pick them out in relation to their Christology.
Mhm.
Um, does not mean to say that we wouldn't have had disagreements about other things, although this is the main thing that they are known for in history. So who knows how much we can say about their other theological positions. But yes.
So much of the development that eventually made dynamic monarchians look strange to later Christians had to do with the prologue of the Gospel of John. I was wondering, because you do cover this briefly in part one. I wonder if you could just tell us, what do you think John's original audience uh, thought John was saying in the prologue of the Gospel?
Sure.
And we can continue from there. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, what I find interesting, like having looked at the Gospel of John from a historical perspective and from a sort of academic perspective, is I think we as a modern audience think that this passage is difficult or confusing, and I'm not entirely sure that John's original audience would have found it difficult or confusing. I think they probably would have got what he was trying to say. Um, the What's important for at least one of the sort of context for the Gospel of John is the wisdom literature of the intertestamental period. And so I mean, even within the scriptures, in the Proverbs, we meet this character of wisdom who is there at creation with God, and it's and is this sort of extended metaphor for wisdom within is this extended metaphor for within that book of Proverbs, sort of advocating wisdom to the readers because that's the mode by which God created the world. And that figure of wisdom occurs in texts in the intertestamental period, like the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Ben Sirach. So this was a known sort of literary device throughout this period. And wisdom is there at creation. Wisdom is embodied in the law, in the prophets. So this idea of a personified figure who is there at creation and helping God create, and then is dwelling with God's people, in the tabernacle, in the law, through as a mode of revelation for God. This was, just standard fare for Jews of the first century.
Right.
It's the thing that makes John's prologue different from what period Jews of this period were expecting is when in verse 14 John says that the word became flesh and dwelt among us, because up till now I don't think the wisdom literature has ever sort of seen wisdom as embodied in a single person. But what John is doing here is absolutely trying to sort of continue that narrative onwards of saying, and here is like the embodiment of that same wisdom principle that was there in all the way back in Proverbs and throughout God's revelation in the Old Testament. here it is now embodied in a single person. And I think actually, whilst John's prologue seems abstract to us, it's actually just the same theme that he runs with throughout the rest of his gospel, which is the manifestation of God through a single individual. Like, so when Philip, says later on in the gospel, to Jesus, show us the Father, and Jesus is like, well, haven't you been with me this so long? You don't need me to show you the Father because I've been with you, effectively. And it's that same concept expressed in different words of, Jesus manifests God. And that's, that language of the Logos in John's prologue is doing exactly that same thing of trying to convey this concept of the way that God manifested himself through the man Jesus Christ.
Very good. So let's switch to Numenius, because you bring him into the discussion, and I think probably most of my audience will not be familiar with this philosopher.
Yep.
So who was he, and why in the world did you begin your treatment of Logos theologians with a non-Christian?
So this is where it gets really fascinating. So Numenius of Apamea is a 2nd century Platonist who'd be classified as a Middle Platonist by historians of this period. So between the sort of classical, the old academy of Platonism, and then the Neoplatonists from Plotinus onwards in the 3rd century, we get this sort of period that's classified as the Middle Platonist period, which is basically this jumble of different figures that we know from history that don't really seem to be particularly coherent or joined up in any particular way, but are all Platonists in the broadest sense of the word, and are interesting because, firstly, because they are beginning to put together thoughts and ideas that will become Neoplatonism, but also because they are contemporary with these really important developments that are happening within Christianity in this period. And Numenius is significant because he is contemporary, both chronologically and geographically, with Justin Martyr. So Justin Martyr originates from Syria, which is where Numenius is from. So it's entirely plausible that they knew each other, that Justin learned from Numenius, or at least that they were contemporaries and had discussions. And they also, we know, they are also contemporary in terms of time period. So there's no obstacle to the idea that Numenius would have known Justin, or vice versa. What's interesting about Numenius in relation to what's happening in Christianity in this period, and where Justin's thought will go, is that Numenius is developing this, what effectively a triad of what he calls 3 gods. And for him, there is the first God, the one is so transcendent that he cannot interact directly with the world. And so there needs to be these other intermediary principles to interact with the world, particularly in relation to the knowledge of God. And it's this second God, whom Numenius will often call the nous, the mind, that communicate that sort of is this intermediary between the first God and the world, and is particularly in relation to the knowledge of God. Now, for Justin, this is important because it's answering for Justin what is a really significant problem that he perceives in, I guess, what we would now in modern terms call a epistemological problem. Like, how do you have knowledge of God? So this was a problem for the Platonists, and this is, Justin says this is the reason why he stops being a Platonist and starts being a Christian, because he says there's this insurmountable problem of how do you get knowledge of God. For some Platonists, the reason why you could have a knowledge of God was to do with the transmigration of the soul, the idea that your soul was immortal, and that it had existed prior to your birth and had been incarnated in you when you were born. And so for Justin, and so for many Platonists, they're like, well, this idea, the fact that you've kind of got this part of you that pre-existed your birth, gives you this sort of like means you're sort of co-natural with the divine, and so you can somehow get a knowledge of God that way. And for Justin, that's not going to work, because Justin comes to reject the idea of this sort of eternal soul. And so instead, he's got to come up with this other idea as to how we get knowledge of God. And part of that is revelation, the revelation he sees in the scriptures. But for a second thing that Justin wants to do is he doesn't want to say that only those people who know the scriptures can have knowledge of God. So he's got to come up with his other idea, and that is the idea of the logos, the idea of a form of knowledge, reason, human, your human reason, your rational faculty that is incipient within all human beings, and that can be used to access the divine. And here he's picking up on themes from Numenius about that, that the way that the knowledge of God is seeded within mankind. So the change that Justin picks up on, and this is, the change that Justin introduces, and this picks back into what we were just talking about, John's gospel. Even though John is using this sort of extended metaphor of wisdom to talk about, the manifestation of God in Jesus, because he uses that word logos, which has, resonances of reason, rationality. For him, for Justin, he can pick up on that word and say, okay, this is similar to what I'm seeing over here in Numenius in relation to how human beings can sort of have knowledge of God. So for Justin, then, this, the Son, the second principle, this sort of second place underneath the transcendent Father, can be that mechanism by which human beings can reach knowledge of God through the seeding of the logos into mankind. So yeah, that's why, again, how Numenius becomes really important in relation to like the development of the logos.
Yeah. It kind of reminded me of an experience I had. I took a class on historical theology at Boston University, and my professor, his first assignment to us was to read Plotinus's Aeneids for like two or three of our first class assignments. And he likened it to being slapped in the face with a dead fish, which I strongly agree with that. Not because of how strong Plotinus expresses himself, but because of how obscure he is to a modern reader reading the Neoplatonic world. And it's interesting because he had us reading a lot of these similar ideas that you find in Numenius of emanations, and you have the one, the monad, the monarch, if we could put it that way, since we're talking about dynamic monarchianism, and then you have the nous, and then you have the world soul and whatnot. And basically, my professor's point in doing that was to sort of sensitize us to the thought structures that were basically in the water in the time of especially Origen of Alexandria, because Plotinus and Origen likely had the same teacher, Ammonius Saccas, and so forth. But you're moving the ball backwards here about a century, I think, to the 2nd century, where Numenius is saying a lot of these similar kinds of, and he talks about ousia. I think I picked that up, and he has this triad, and he has a lot to do with logos, and Justin picks these ideas up. It's just sort of like the intellectual structures or concepts available, and
Yeah.
whether he got it from Numenius or not, I don't know if you can really prove that. But you can use Numenius as sort of an indication of what ideas were current in that world, in that place during that time. So, whether he picks it up from Numenius or not probably doesn't matter, right?
No, not at all. Not at the end of the day. You're right. The point is that it's The point is that these ideas are in the air.
Yeah.
But there is at least both in terms of like the system and the that they're using, but also the sort of language and the analogies that are being used by Justin and Numenius. There's enough similarity there that lead us to sort of think that even if Justin doesn't know Numenius directly, he knows the same ideas. He knows the same thoughts, so he's
Yeah.
getting it from somewhere, right? He's getting
Yeah.
it from that
Yeah.
same thought world.
So, what I hear you saying is that this external, well, let me first say this, and you say this in the book as well. There's a profound anxiety among ancient Christian thinkers and other kinds of thinkers, especially the Gnostics, over the issue of immanence and transcendence. And how in the world can God be the creator? And this is not a problem that any of us struggle with today. But if you look at the early Gnostics, like Secret Apocryphon of John, or if you look at what survives of Valentinus or of Justin, David Brockie wrote a great book about this. You see, they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're all kind of answering the question, well, how in the world can we get God to create when we know God can't do anything because we're good Platonists? And Platonists know that a change is thereby an introduction of an imperfection.
Yeah.
So they're all like struggling with this, and this logos concept is just like right there as a ready-made answer. And then Numenius wouldn't have done this, but Justin is the guy that makes a Christological connection to the logos. How does that develop as we move forward through Athenagoras and Irenaeus and Origen and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we've talked about, so for Justin, he's seems to be the first one who's made this connection between the logos in John's gospel and that same sort of rational principle that the Platonists were talking about. And so he essentially makes this logos into a person in a more powerful sense that maybe the Platonists would have done. And he obviously brings that into Jesus. Now, obviously, then has Christological significance because now this logos is a pre-existent person, and this and he's becoming now the second God in a triad. What's the sort of there's a couple of sort of then debates that have to take place, or some things that need to be ironed out, I suppose, for this thought, which is, if the logos is an emanation from God, does that mean that he is created does he have a beginning in time, and is he therefore created and therefore not eternal? And secondly, then, what does it mean for God to sort of emanate his rational faculty, his reason, out from himself? And so there's a couple of different ways that people will go on this in relation to whether or not they want to say that the logos is eternal or not, whether that sort of moment of emanation is a beginning in time or not, a creation or not, and then to what extent they want to say that the logos is God's rational faculty that sort of exists within God and is emanated out of God, and to what extent they want to say that this logos is a separate person. And they're not, that, to be fair, always entirely clear. I think Athenagoras is probably, as a philosopher, is probably the most clear in relation to where he wants to take this. Whereas, for example, Irenaeus, who is not a philosopher, he's a theologian, is very equivocal and ambiguous. As he doesn't want to say the Son had a beginning, but he also doesn't want to say anything concrete in relation to what he thinks the origin of the logos is. So
There's that famous passage in Against Heresies where he says, it's impious to say anything about the generation of the logos, because he probably, my guess is, he's been fighting with all these Gnostics, and he knows that, like, basically anything you say about it, you're going to get into trouble. So he just like piously says, "Oh, it's a mystery, and who knows, right?" It's
Yeah.
not very helpful.
Irenaeus is fascinating because as I say, he knows what he's against. He's against Gnosticism, and he doesn't want to push the logos in a direction that sounds too much like the sort of eons and all the sort of different intermediaries the Gnostics were coming up with. He wants to avoid that, but also he wants, he is trying to maintain this same level of uh, for the logos that Justin did, the sort of same sort of significance. So he ends up, very ambiguous in relation to what he's actually saying. But he is nevertheless, Irenaeus is incredibly influential on the development of thought of that period, particularly, his book Against Heresies is quite clear in terms of trying to establish orthodoxy in this period by effectively saying identify all the people he's against. So there's a couple of things that happen as well in this period, which is in relation to the logos. So it's really sort of Origen who begins to sort of solidify some of this thinking out in relation to the logos, and trying to work out, I guess, like the risk of introducing the logos as this second principle under the Father is that you end up with a second God. And Justin calls him another God. He calls him a second God, and even Origen will do that. But Origen also wants to say, no, but there is also only one God, because after all, he's a Christian and he's a monotheist, and trying to reconcile that problem as to like how can this logos be a second God and yet maintain only one God is going to be a problem that's going to sort of they're going to wrestle with for a while. But this is where we begin to see sort of, I guess, like the trajectory of the Trinity moving away from this hierarchical pattern that Justin has of Father, then the Son, then the Spirit, much like the Middle Platonists, and moving towards this sort of co-equal Trinity of the later period, trying to move away from exactly that problem of more than one God.
And there's a lot of detail on that in the book if people want to know more about it. As far as the Dynamic Monarchians, though, which we kind of got away from them a bit in this conversation, let me ask you a question that I'm curious to hear your answer, if it is answerable. And that is, who was the first Dynamic Monarchian?
So that is a difficult question. So I guess it depends how you define your terms, doesn't it? The earliest one that we traditionally identify as being a dynamic monarchian is the Theodotus of Byzantium in the middle to late 2nd century. But we know about him, and he's called out as such specifically because he is excommunicated for his beliefs. He is called out for them and regarded as a heretic afterwards. So in that sense, he is the first, in the sense of the first person to formally be excommunicated for denying the pre-existence of Jesus. But obviously the case I'm going to make in the book is that actually dynamic monarchianism was part of the mainstream up until that point. And so in one sense, it's sort of a false question, who is the first dynamic monarchianism? Maybe it was Jesus, right? Maybe Jesus was the first dynamic monarchian.
Yeah, it's a totally loaded question, totally unfair, which is why it was fun to ask. But I couldn't resist. You could say, well, weren't the authors of the Gospels dynamic monarchians? You could make that case as well, or maybe the Apostle Paul, certainly Jesus, all fair game. But within church history itself, Theodotus is where the topic really shows up big on the radar. But you do talk about some of these Jewish Christian groups too, and they would presumably predate Theodotus, right?
Sure.
That's the whole question of Ebionites, other Ebionites, and Nazarenes is very difficult because our sources are confusing and conflicted. But I wonder if you could just say a couple of words or maybe put out a hypothesis on
Yeah.
what you think about the Jewish Christians in the late first, early second century.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess like let's put a couple of markers down historically. So obviously we know that the earliest Christians would have been Jewish Christians. That's where Christianity comes from, and we know from Acts of the Apostles that they are called the Christians are called Nazarenes very early on. And so you've kind of got that, within the sort of first half of the first century. And then way in the sort of late second century, Irenaeus calls out a group he calls the Ebionites, who he identifies as being Jewish Christians. And for him, he calls them out as heretics, in part because they insist on keeping the law of Moses, and also because they have a view of Jesus that he is the son of Mary and Joseph. So they would then, so the Ebionites in general, by that description, would therefore have denied the pre-existence of Jesus. I slightly move away from them in the book because of that sort of, because they, at least according to Irenaeus, deny the virgin birth, and I'm sort of trying to distinguish them from the Dynamic Monarchians, as I'm trying to sort of identify this group who would have accepted sort of all of the sort of mainstream Christian books and not, pick their own scriptures or whatever else. But trying to sort of join the dots between those two things, the earliest Jewish Christians that we find in, Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, and then these Ebionites, is a tricky job. The other bits and pieces that we know about from history, we sort of know of Origen, who refers to this sort of group of other Ebionites. This seems to be the second group. And then we know from Jerome, he refers to these sort of Nazarenes. And there seems to be a confusion amongst these writers as to, is Ebionites just what people call Jewish Christians in general, or are there sort of multiple groups of Jewish Christians, and if so, do they sort of have these different names? The conclusion that I sort of pushed towards in the book, I argue on the basis of the evolution of the Gospels. So we know by the 4th century there is a gospel known as the Gospel of the Ebionites, and it seems to have been seems to be based upon the canonical Gospels, but has been edited to remove the virgin birth story, the infancy narratives. So we know that thing exists. We also know from this period that there was a gospel circulating in Hebrew as well. And it's at least plausible that, and again, this is a lot of this is conjecture, but it's at least plausible that this was very, very early. And there's at least a case to be made that maybe this Hebrew gospel was the earliest gospel and sort of predates Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is a tradition very early on about Matthew's gospel, for example, that Matthew's gospel was originally written in Hebrew. Now, people who know about about Greek will tell you that the canonical gospel that was ascribed to Matthew in our New Testament probably didn't have a Hebrew original. It's not that sort of Greek. And again, I'm depending on other people to tell me such things. So that raises the question then, well, if there was a gospel that was ascribed to Matthew written in Hebrew, well, could it be this Hebrew gospel that was circulating on? So if you've kind of got this history of gospels where you've got an early Hebrew gospel, and then much later you've got a gospel of the Ebionites that seems to be dependent on the canonical gospels and heavily edited, that seems to suggest that sort of development of that gospel seems to suggest a development of a community that starts quite firmly within that sort of community of the early Christians and then deviates away. And you could at least plausibly hypothesize about a group of Christians who, faced with that controversy we find in Acts about about whether or not the Gentiles can be incorporated into the Christian community or not, you can well imagine that there was a rump of that community that just said, nope, we're not having it. We're going to stick to the law. We're going to stick to circumcision. We're going to be, we're going to be those, be Christians who stick to the law as well. And so it's at least plausible that's where the Ebionites are coming from. They're sort of this rump of people who never really gave up on the law of Moses, never really gave up on circumcision, wanted to continue down that road. And maybe for some of them, then actually even things like the virgin birth were too difficult. And so they had to sort of amend their views and amend the scriptures that they were using precisely to sort of continue to fit into that theological framework. Whereas the majority of Jewish Christians, i.e. those who were sort of ethnic Jewish but became Christians, were actually more within, let's call the mainstream of Christianity at this period, and maybe they were the ones who answered to this term Nazarene, as Jerome uses it. So I think you've kind of got that sort of that spectrum of opinion, I think, within the Jewish Christian community within this period, where the sort of Ebionites, as Irenaeus knows them, are sort of at that extreme end in relation to their theological perspectives.
Yeah, and Irenaeus is predisposed to pick the clearest example of the most extreme view of any particular group that he's exposing as heretical, because it makes his case. He's not going to pick some milder form that is roughly compatible. He's going to fixate on the extremes. So let's. I did want to ask you about Afrahat the Persian. Have you ever done any business with him? In his demonstration 17, it seems he seems to write in sort of a dynamic monarchian way, but he may have believed in pre-existence. I don't know. Have you done any work on him yet?
No, he's not one of mine. So
okay, yeah, he's a little later. He's 4th century, so definitely an interesting character. Even if he did believe in pre-existence, he rather strongly makes the case that when Christians apply the word God to Jesus, they're doing the same thing that happened in the Old Testament for Moses and for other figures. And then he doesn't go on to say, and he's also pre-existent. He doesn't say that. So it's just a fascinating text to consider, but it's a little outside of your time frame, I think. So you talk about the Jewish Christians, you talk about Theodotus, you talk about Beryllus of Bostra, Artemin, Paul of Samosata, kind of like the leading, I don't know if you want to call them advocates or representatives of the Dynamic Monarchians. Of course, we don't have time to go through each of those in this conversation, but I just wonder if you could give me sort of an overall picture, like if you didn't have the burden of, I don't know, what am I thinking of? Scholarly restraint.
yeah.
You just wanted to sort of summarize how you see the whole thing developing one way or the other during the period. How would you put it together in sort of a brief way?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I think, so let's put it this way. I mean, so I guess the standard narrative about the Dynamic Monarchians is that they are heretics. There's a sort of a proto-orthodox, let's use that term again, mainstream of Trinitarian thought, and these guys are just deviating from it. I suppose that's a plausible scenario. A different, I suppose, a different scenario is that they are all part of one church, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. So the narrative that I try and argue for is the idea that actually these are all calling on the same tradition that exists within the church. And broadly, what I think has happened, and you say, let's throw off the shackles of academic restraint. What I think happened is that what we now classify as dynamic monarchianism, as though it's sort of this separate thing, was just one of the traditions that existed within the mainstream right up until the late 2nd century, when Theodotus is first excommunicated. So I think that broadly there will have been Christians who held these views within churches throughout Christendom in the late 1st and early 2nd century. And I think that broadly the reason why we see these figures like Borellus and Paul and Theodotus is not because they're coming up with something new, but because they are repeating something old. They are broadly repeating what they hold to be true, and they're coming up against something that is new, which is the Logos and the theories of Justin Martyr and then his successors, and that is being pushed by and as those theories are adopted and held to be convincing by the Bishop of Rome and amongst others, they are pushing that same doctrine on the churches, and that's where we come into conflict. So Paul Theodotus, who is originally from Byzantium, comes to Rome. He's teaching what he always thought to be true in relation to the nature of Jesus, and then eventually comes into conflict with other Christians in Rome who are now teaching these Logos ideas of Justin and others, and ultimately Theodotus loses out and has to form his own church because he's no longer welcome within the Church of Rome. And we've seen these same disputes and battles happening at different points at different churches from the late 2nd century onwards, until the point at which a single orthodoxy can emerge, which ultimately closes out the option for dynamic monarchians to exist within mainstream Christianity.
I wonder if you would agree with this analogy. We have these little buggers in the United States called ticks. I don't know if you have those in England too.
Yeah,
they're terrible, and they weren't very prevalent when I was a kid. We didn't worry about them. Never did my mother ever say, "Oh, let's check you for ticks when you come in from playing out in the woods." But these days, at least where I live, they're very common, and not this time of year, obviously. But imagine the scenario where a tick affixes itself to a human body, bites someone, and injects Lyme disease into that person, right? So for a while, that person has, a healthy body, but an invader from Middle Platonism, so to speak, comes in and injects this foreign substance into the body. Over time, the body will, succumb or overcome, one or the other, this infusion. And so it seems like what you're saying is that for a while within the body of Christ, there were both, or I mean, let's be honest, there were much more than just two Christologies around,
absolutely.
especially in the 2nd century. So there's all these different ideas around, and like eventually one does win out over the others. And of course, the story of how that happened is really more of a 4th century story, because even as late as then, there's lots of people that are really uncomfortable saying that the Son is eternal, or saying that he is co-equal with the Father. And so, but eventually, the outside invader wins, and the body of Christ is in a sense crippled with this condition. So that's kind of a morbid analogy, but I'm trying to put together what you're saying into kind of a recognizable illustration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we've been talking about part 1 of your book, Just give the audience a teaser for parts 2 and 3. You know, what can they expect to see in there? Because it is much more than what we've just been talking about here.
Yeah. So absolutely. So part one is about trying to pull together everything that we can know about those who are explicitly identified in our sources as what we now call dynamic monarchianism. What I try to do in part two is project backwards from these people in the 3rd and 2nd centuries to try and think about what can we know about dynamic monarchianism in the early 2nd century and late 1st century, in this period where maybe they wouldn't have been called out they wouldn't have been called out as heretics because they weren't regarded as heresy in that period. So what can we know about these about this period, and sort of how can we demonstrate from our sources that this Christology existed within the church and pre-existed the sort of logos theories of Justin. So that's what part 2 is about. And then part 3 is to try and bring that all the way back to what primitive Christology, so the teaching of the apostles, and tries to answer that sort of question that I put on the front on the cover, which is, is this the earliest Christology? And so I try and argue about firstly, like, do we see pre-existence in the earliest teachings of the apostles? Do we see a form of adoptionism in relation to the Christology of the earliest apostles? And then how early is belief in the virgin birth in Christianity? And from that, trying to sort of make the case that actually dynamic monarchianism goes all the way back right to the earliest apostles.
Very good. So if people want to learn more about this, they can get the book. I've got it here. This is the 2nd edition, published by Theophilus Press. They did a nice job with this. Have you gotten a paper copy yet?
Oh no, I'm still waiting.
You're still, yeah. It probably takes a while to get over the pond, as they say. But yeah, if you want to pick that up, you can get it at Amazon or a number of other booksellers. And if people want to follow you, Dr. Gaston, where would they go? Do you have a website or social media or anything like that?
Yeah, so if you thomas-gaston.com, it's my website, and you'll find all the various things that I've written over the years linked out
And
there.
you're a bit omnivorous too. You're not staying in the lane of just like early Christian history, right?
Not at all, not at all. So
I appreciate that. What else have you done?
So I've got a variety of interests. I mean, I've written so my book, Historical Issues in the Book of Daniel, which came out quite a while ago, but it was completely different in the sense of it's relating to the Old Testament, obviously, and it's relating to sort of questions of history in relation to what can we know about Daniel in that period. But then also from a sort of from a completely different angle, I also, because I work in publishing, I've written quite a lot about peer review and publication ethics as well. So, for any of your listeners who are interested in that, they'll find articles on that as well.
Very good. Well, thanks so much for talking with me today.
No worries. No worries.